My name is Diana Delbecchi, and I actually grew up in Lenexa, Kansas. At 16 years old, my family actually moved, and so I had to integrate into a Canadian school system. And so I think part of sort of what has led me to the path that I've chosen has been that a pivotal time at 16, sort of moving and getting to see the U.S. in a different light, which then kind of brought me to study psychology at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. In Green Bay, I was working with undocumented students and became increasingly frustrated with their lack of access to education, and I just needed to understand the complex situation more. So I went abroad to the National University of Ireland in Galway, and I studied a master's in gender, globalization, and human rights, where I focused my entire studies and thesis on the right to education within the human rights framework, and looking at particularly the access to higher education. And from that piece of research that I did, I actually took it and applied it to the context in Greece for youth refugee populations, because there's a lot of similarities with refugee populations and undocumented student populations. So, of course, in the fall of 2015, we all were watching the news when really the height of the refugee crisis landed on the shores of Greece. And during that time, I was in Europe kind of listening and reading a lot about the crisis, but knowing that I had to finish my master's degree before there was anything I could really do. So once I got to that point where I was finally able to do something, I started doing bit of research to figure out what it was I could do to help. I just felt compelled that since I had finished my master's degree in the subject of human rights, and of course there was so much going on in Europe that was right at our doorsteps, that I felt compelled that I had to do something, but I wanted to do something very strategic that applied my skills. So I began researching organizations and areas to work in, and I came across the organization IMU that was doing educational programming in Ritsona refugee camp. In all honesty, I was really terrified. I really didn't feel that it was something I should do. I tried my hardest to find opportunities to contribute to the crisis in Greece in any way I could that didn't take me there. But as it turned out, the organization really needed somebody on the ground to do that piece of research. And so I reluctantly said yes, I would go, and I negotiated that I would go for a month. And that was it. I would do what I could in that month. I would do the research, and I would get out of there. And I was very adamant that I didn't want to spend too much time at the camp, because I was very hesitant that my own experience wasn't enough to really make any sort of large contribution, that it was just going to be a drop in the ocean, and it was just so vast that I was very afraid of doing more harm than I was going to do good. But as it turned out, I went, and I ended up spending 6 months in Ritsona camp, not only doing the piece of research, but implementing it afterwards. When I was first at the camp, I conducted a bit of research with the youth, primarily around the types of education that they had coming to Greece, and also the types of education that they were hoping to get and continue, to sort of get a survey of where people were at and where they wanted to go, but then also doing some policy research on what was actually feasible and what was available to refugee youth in Greece. What could we actually provide to them? And then I put together some recommendations for the organization that ended up really boiling down to we have no idea where these people are going to end up, so we have no idea what language we can assist them with. So the conclusion was we need to teach them English. It will be the only language that will serve them well in whatever country they go forward to. So that was sort of the first thing, and I ended up implementing a curriculum and putting together a youth program around education that targeted helping those students gain some of the skills and the language skills they needed to then go on to do studying on either an online level or hopefully then get into the Greek school system eventually and be able to learn at a formal school. For me, when I got to the camp and I was doing sort of my surveying and my research, you can't help but build relationships, particularly with the youth, because most of the youth that I worked with were unaccompanied. They were there alone, oftentimes had been abandoned or orphaned due to the war in Syria, had often witnessed their family members murdered in front of them, or kidnapped in front of them and taken somewhere else and never heard from again. And as we talked, as I built these relationships and heard from these students what they were studying and what their hopes and dreams were, you couldn't help but want to know more about them and help them achieve those dreams. One afternoon, about a week before I left, I had my plane ticket home, and I was sitting with one student who was a Palestinian refugee inside of Syria and hadn't really been able to fully have his rights validated in that context, and then was then forced to flee again, had lost his entire family, and was just sitting there in front of me saying, you know, if I can get out of here, all I want to do is have a tent on a mountain and be alone, because I have no reason to do anything else. But yet he was such a great artist, and he had so much that he wanted to, you know, he had so many other hopes and dreams, but was still suffering with so much depression and so much loneliness and really feeling forgotten from the world. But we had built this friendship, and it was at that moment that I really was like, well, I think I'm gonna stay, and I'm gonna do this program and work with you and be there every day to prove that somebody cares about you, that somebody wants to see your future and believes in your future. And so it was really after that conversation, and it was a lengthy one, that I decided I didn't want to go and that I did want to stay. And I feel that that was authentic, and I built really strong relationships as a result of that commitment that I made to stay.